Thank you for joining me. I'm Maya Lesov, and my guest today is Michael Delahoyde, who teaches English and Humanities at Washington State University. Dr. Delahoyde is also nationally recognized as a critic in the Shakespeare authorship controversy, which I hope we get a chance to talk about here in a little bit. Welcome, Dr. Delahoyde. Thank you for joining me here in the studio.
Thank you, Maya. Glad to be talking about the most important stuff in human existence.
It really is. So my first question for you is kind of fundamental. You're a professor in English. Can you tell me what that involves and maybe why it's important?
It involves a lot of grading, but that's not why it's important. It's important, I think, because what I'm teaching is especially useful for creative and critical thinking skills. Classes I teach involve, articulating your thoughts, forming them and articulating them through writing as well. But English and the humanities are, like I say, useful, I think, especially because it's almost a direct line or a direct demand to have to face processing, thinking through text, materials, values, your own impulses.
What about the material that's in the humanities? So examining the human condition, human thinking, is kind of the meat of what we teach? Besides the critical thinking, how is that valuable to
I think so too, because I don't
students?
think there's any other discipline or field that gives you that same window or forces you to really examine something that's useful in that way, that's really tapped into human experience. You can understand the workings of a human, you can understand brain chemicals and matters like that, but even people who are really bright and really want to help me get through hard times and explain, well, maybe we can explain people's nasty behavior towards you through hormones. It doesn't help, but Shakespeare helps. Mythology helps.
Why do you think that is? I'm curious about the surround sound nature of the value that the humanities bring to people's lives. Why should fiction in particular have something to say about real life, since fiction is made up?
Right, but fiction can't be made up just, even fantasy emerges from some kind of impulse to work something through, that you're curious about an issue, you're curious about your experience, and you might project it, into science fiction, but it's a way of objectifying it maybe, or removing it from your actual experience, and then processing it somehow, or seeing, what if we play it out this way, and what does that mean? And I think that anything that's successful, any creative work that's successful in any of the humanities or arts, if it's going to be successful, does give you a point, maybe very subtly, but there's a point to it. And again, I think it's harder to see other disciplines or other avenues of understanding our experience as yielding that kind of satisfying point, that there's something that you can really get on a level of your soul rather than rather than your brain.
Let's talk a little bit about Shakespeare. What I've heard people say about Shakespeare is that despite the fact that everybody says he's so great, he really is that great. So was he the best writer in the English language?
Well, first, that is my experience too. I avoided Shakespeare because everybody said he was so great, and I was always expected as an English major, well, of course you love Shakespeare, and I thought, I always rebel against that, and so I said, well, I'm taking this turn over into Chaucer instead. You have your Shakespeare, and things kind of fade out for me in the Battle of Bosworth or something. It wasn't until, well, actually, I would, in survey courses, have to teach a bit of Shakespeare now and again. So Midsummer Night's Dream or Hamlet, I worked in. And I still really didn't get it. And in fact, part of most people's experience, even if they end up in English somehow, is that you have to read very differently from what you're used to. it's a weird leap from Goodnight Moon into some kind of form where there is verse, right, in poetry, and I had a hard time figuring out how am I supposed to be reading poetry exactly? And the same especially true for drama as well. You don't have a narrator, and when I was reading Shakespeare plays that I wasn't familiar with, sometimes, so-called problem plays, I was absolutely baffled. I thought I had some, reading skills and thinking skills there, but I was absolutely baffled sometimes by these plays. I didn't understand where's the comedy, if this is a comedy. I didn't understand what's the relationships with these characters. Who am I supposed to think is being validated somehow? Whose perspective am I supposed to, be mocking? I just didn't get it sometimes. And this is because you don't have that controlling narrative voice necessarily. You don't have in Shakespeare a whole lot of stage directions at all. No clues on how people are acting, or no blocking and even facial gestures. It's all just in the text itself. And why it was so baffling sometimes, why some of these plays were problem plays that got me intrigued but also intimidated, wasn't really solved until I stumbled into the authorship controversy. Then some things made sense.
So explain that. What is the Shakespeare authorship controversy?
For countless decades, maybe hundreds of years now, there seems to have been a mismatch between what we know about Shakespeare of Stratford. In his signatures, all that survive are 6 signatures on legal documents from the last few years of his life, and there's never that middle E suggesting that you would have heard Shakespeare in Stratford. It always looks like Shakespeare, and other spellings, Shakespeare, C-K-S, Shakespeare with a X, Shagspur with a G. It always sounds like it's Shakespeare. That does seem to be a disconnect from the pen name Shakespeare, sometimes appearing with a hyphen there, and a handy pseudonym as an allusion to the spear shaker, Athena, the patron goddess of theater. So anybody might have cleverly taken that name as a pen name. It just happens to match up a little bit with this Shakespeare fellow who gets thrown into the mix. The play I was thinking of when I was talking about earlier, All's Well That Ends Well, is one that I just didn't get, and the students voted for it at the end of the first semester of a whole semester of Shakespeare, thinking they're very clever. Oh, All's Well That Ends Well, that'll be a... And it sounds like a good time, too. But it was absolutely baffling. So when I was searching for some help in the bookstore at Ashland, because a trip to the Shakespeare Festival was involved at the time, I glanced at this book that was interesting, having to do with the authorship controversy, and I thought, oh, that's a fascinating topic, but it's $50, and besides, I'm on a mission here to try to understand All's Well That Ends Well. But there was a little book next to it, only about $12, also about the authorship question, but I could see from the index it had a little section on All's Well That Ends Well, so I thought, all right, here's my book. I sat down outside. I saw Prince Hal from the night before playing Frisbee with Falstaff or somebody, and I read this little section. Essentially what it was saying again and again throughout the book was that Shakespeare is more or less autobiographical, or at least the Shakespeare plays emerge logically, of course, out of the playwright's own experience. And the reason All's Well That Ends Well doesn't make a lot of sense to people is that even though it's autobiographical in the same sense that Hamlet is autobiographical, it didn't really get that Shakespeare treatment in revision after revision that makes, I think, Hamlet end up seeming universal. This one seemed more raw and unprocessed. And so the weirdnesses make sense as coming out of the life of who many of us think is the real author.
Who is?
Who is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. He emerged as a candidate in the early part of the 20th century after Bacon had his day. And still, I mean, you can check this online. There are still people, I've met some people who believe Bacon is the true author, Marlowe, but most doubters of the tradition, most doubters of the orthodox explanation of Shakespeare is Shakespeare, think the case for the Earl of Oxford makes the most sense, because his life, his experiences match up. And his concerns, you can tell from surviving biographical materials and his own letters, his traumas, miseries, horrors, and concerns are the ones that the Shakespeare plays again and again are trying to process.